I've watched a number of Lord Sumption's interviews when he's been speaking, I don't know, to Sky News and the BBC. And it struck me that he has consistently said that he bases his opinion and supposedly his legal assessment on what he sees on television. That is the bait.
Oh, wow.
She came out on BBC, on Hard Talk, and vindicated every single word I had said.
Courts in Nazi Germany that had so much respect to the population. Legal institutions finding Jews and Jewish institutions guilty of all sorts of ludicrous things. And on the one hand, always 30 years later or 100 years later, the world looks back with shame at how could the courts do that. This was clearly part of a society-wide buying into this mind virus of Jew demonization, Jew derangement. And it's clear that's what's happening today.
Once you have these manufactured documents of false evidence, but that have either the UN or the ICJ stamp of approval on them, that whole process becomes a very, very different one. These modern blood libels of occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and now, of course, genocide. I'm hopeful that these will go the same way, but it will take time. One of the key aspects of education that we need to commit ourselves to is making people across the West, across the civilized world, understand that those that are wielding this weapon of lawfare are coming for their way of life, and that this is not just Israel's problem.
Welcome everyone to another, and this time very exciting special episode of Real Talk with Rabbi Rowe, where we try to go beneath the surface on a lot of important topics. This is by popular demand, and we're really excited to have Natasha Hausdorff with us to discuss the lawfare against Israel and many related topics. For anybody who doesn't know, I'm sure all of you do, but Natasha is a very acclaimed lawyer, barrister in the United Kingdom, has had an illustrious career, has become very famous in her work in recent months and years for UK Lawyers for Israel, combating, sometimes seemingly single-handedly, the deluge of lawfare, legal warfare against the state of Israel, the Jewish state. Before we get into that and a lot of related topics, Natasha, something I really wanted to ask you, which is the woman behind the legend. What is it that got you into this in the first place? You have this amazing career. You're very successful by all accounts. What is it that got you to dedicate time? There's so many people out there say, I wish I could do something, and you're doing so much. Was it a moment? Was it a journey? Could you share with us?
Well, thank you so much for having me on and for the very kind words. Perhaps I can take the opportunity to answer this question with a short clarification, which is that what I do is far from single-handed. I am blessed to be able to work with some of the most incredible lawyers committed to the rule of law, committed to combating misinformation and lawfare against the state of Israel. And I've had the privilege of working alongside them for over a decade. And it is those people that inspire me to keep doing this, that give me the energy to continue. And that have really facilitated, this incredible vehicle by which we are able to involve volunteers of all kinds in standing up against anti-Semitism, providing support to victims of anti-Semitism, and increasingly in the work that I'm focused on in the international legal arena, pushing back against so much of that very damaging misinformation. And I have to say that my commitment, I suppose, to this line of work, which I've frequently referred to as the hobby, but now it seems far more all-encompassing than that. That began a very long time ago when I started secondary school. And that was my first exposure at a wonderful school in London, was my first exposure to the liberal, intellectual elite style of misinformation about Israel specifically. And then when I started studying law, I saw how that had taken hold so deeply in the legal fraternity. So it was a combination of really those realizations and finding this incredible group of people that together we have been able to right so many wrongs,
Wow. That's amazing. I guess watching from the outside, we often see your face and don't realize just how broad a group of people there might be helping you. I think there's so many points I want to come back on there. One which I want to dive straight into, because you used the word anti-Semitism, you've used defending Israel. And I think to most of us, it's relatively obvious when the two are conflated, or when anti-Semitism seeps into the absurdities of criticism of Israel. And I always say to people, it's amazing how many people out there seem to put hand on heart, be able to say, I'm not anti-Semitic. And some might be very disingenuous. Sometimes seems to be a confusion between racial bigotry against Jews versus this historically ever-present social pathology, this need to demonize the collective Jew. And since today the collective Jew is Israel, this need to portray Israel as uniquely evil. And on October 7th, we saw the launch of seven militaries aiming their weapons against Israel. And we also saw this global demonization campaign that rapidly moved into the legal sphere. And, we've got to this day, case still rolling in the ICJ accusing Israel of genocide. I mean, it's like the most outrageous, sick and absurd accusation. I was just discussing with somebody the other day, like, where else in the world could you have a war where at any moment, God forbid, Israel, had they, God forbid, wanted to be genocidal, could have, within a matter of hours, with conventional weapons, wiped out 2.2 million Gazans easily. And instead, 2 years later, 98.5% of the civilian population survived that. Urban warfare, where there were human shields, the population grew. Israel put immense efforts into keeping them fed, keeping them alive, keeping the safe zones. And now Israel's got a rehabilitation plan, and backed by the international community the moment Hamas gives its weapons. How could anybody sane put that in the same paragraph as genocide, except to say this is the opposite of it? And yet here we are with a legal case, with an ICC arrest warrant against the Israeli prime minister for 7 days of withholding food, when not one Palestinian died of starvation during that time. Like, how do we get to this crazy place that these aren't just being immediately dismissed in these courts? Could you fill us in and help us here?
We get there on the back of a massive campaign of misinformation, which has been the work of decades. And so I will often hear that refrain that you mentioned, I'm not anti-Semitic, and it's often followed by a but, right? I'm not anti-Semitic, but I can't possibly support a genocide, or I can't possibly support the targeting of children. And it is that level of absurdity of accusation that has gained traction, in the same way, I argue, that in the Middle Ages, Jews were accused of killing Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual. Now, the ancient blood libel does still exist in certain parts of the world. I've seen supposedly well-respected Arab academics discussing massacres of children in Paris in the 18th century on Arab media, as though this was, an indisputed part of history. So it is alive and well in some parts of the world, but for the most part, in the civilized world, the ancient blood libel is recognized for what it was, a deeply anti-Semitic canard that had absolutely no basis in reality. I'm hopeful that the modern blood libels that are so pervasive today, in the same way that the ancient one was in its time, these modern blood libels of occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and now, of course, genocide, I'm hopeful that these will go the same way, but it will take time and a concerted effort and initiative to explain to these individuals who are so taken up in this misinformation that they have been lied to. They've had the wool pulled over their eyes. And that is an extremely difficult task, where the media is playing such a critical role in spreading this disinformation. And there are all sorts of reasons for that, in terms of editorial lines and perhaps a degree of latent anti-Semitism within many of these newsrooms. But also, let's be frank about this, a fear amongst journalists reporting for the region, from the region, of telling the truth, because of what internationally prescribed terrorist organizations, Hamas and Hezbollah, will do to them or their colleagues as a result of that truth being reported. I mean, this is common knowledge amongst reporters in the Middle East, that they need to be very careful what they say, lest there be repercussions visited upon them or others connected with their network. That's almost as, if you will, presented as the cost of doing business in the Middle East, and that the cost of that cannot be underestimated because it has misled so many millions of people as to what has been happening, not just over the last 2.5 years in the Middle East, but of course for many decades before that, as we are seeing historical narratives being entirely rewritten. But I would perhaps just highlight this. I'm frequently asked, when does criticism of Israel become illegitimate? When does it cross over into anti-Semitism? And I think there's a very simple, straightforward answer to this, which I very, very rarely hear being addressed. And it's when it's not true. If you are putting libels against Israel, that is not criticism. If you are suggesting that Israel is committing genocide or had starved the civilian population despite all of the publicly available evidence to the contrary, the volume of aid that Israel was facilitating into the Gaza Strip, the unprecedented measures taken by the IDF to protect civilians in armed conflict, if despite all of the very readily available evidence, you are deliberately manufacturing falsehoods against the state of Israel, and there are many individuals that fall into that category, that, to my mind, is classic anti-Semitism, because it is propagating these falsehoods. And the difficulty is that so much of what Israel is called out for is simply untrue. It is very difficult to find, supposedly legitimate criticism of Israel, because these tropes are either entirely fabricated, or they are presented in such a fashion and absent any context to essentially make them deeply, deeply misleading and therefore also untrue. So really that's the crux of the matter. It's not, a difficult equation. When people spread falsehoods and essentially defame, I use that word advisedly because in law you cannot defame a state. There is no, defamation case that Israel can take out, simply because government institutions, armies are expected to be subject to all forms of criticism, even illegitimate ones. They're considered to be big enough to take it. And that's a critical cornerstone of freedom of speech in a democratic society. But of course, it's open to abuse of this nature. For a wholesale, wall-to-wall coverage that we've seen of falsehoods against the IDF, against the state of Israel, and falsehoods that, from my perspective, very significantly manipulate, weaponize, abuse, invert international law. That's, I think, one of the major lenses through which we've seen a great deal of these false stories manifesting themselves.
Okay, I agree. I think that's actually an extremely critical clarification. But I think here's an issue. There are people manufacturing these stories. There are people manufacturing and creating complete fabrications. But there's also a massive social thought climate. I mean, I don't want to really call out, but I think almost anybody, decent human being who inhabits the political left, let's say, whose news sources might include The Guardian and Al Jazeera and whatever, as is quite common, and a lot of social media, and they are just going to be bombarded with things that are stated as facts. They're going to be, I always say it like this, you don't need to have anti-Semitic blood inside you to be carried and swept by a socialization of these ideas. Yeah, and I tell you, I wanted to actually ask you about a story I think you were directly involved with, because this shook me quite deeply. And maybe I misunderstood some parts. Maybe you can help me. It was, I think, April 2024. The ICJ, a few months earlier, the International Court of Justice, South Africa, had taken Israel to court, and they'd issued some preliminary provisional telling Israel they should do what Israel anyway had to do in a war, take care of civilians, make sure food's there, any evidence is preserved, etc. And a bunch of lawyers, I was in England at the time quite innocently, just so this news flash comes up, like hundreds of lawyers have signed this letter to the United Kingdom government saying that they mustn't trade arms with Israel because there's a plausible genocide. Yes. Right? And then 2 days later, if I remember correctly, came this massive counter letter with over 1,000 lawyers and judges and whatever saying that's a complete misreading. That's not what the ICJ said. And I remember, I think it was a Shabbat that weekend, and it was like, okay, good. We got people countering this stuff. Fantastic. Then a few days or weeks later, I forget when, some senior judges, I think including Supreme Court judges, again, I'm sorry, I'm not so up to date with who's who in the legal world, but I seem to think there was either sitting or probably former Supreme Court judges who'd signed this big letter saying, no, the pro-Israel people got this completely wrong. No way did the ICJ issue an 80-page ruling just to say that it's plausible that the Palestinians need some protections. They clearly were saying it's plausible there's a real genocide going on. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, did all those hundreds of lawyers defending Israel get it completely wrong? These are like these brilliant legal minds. And then not long after that, the president, I think, of the ICJ, you can fill in all these details, was on an interview where she said, no, we didn't say it's plausible there's a genocide going on. We said it's plausible there's a group that fits the criteria for protections. And so we gave these interim things. We didn't say it's plausible genocide. And I remember stopping at that moment and saying, 1 second, let me get clear what's going on. And again, maybe I'm misreading. We had some of the most brilliant legal minds. I'm assuming anyone on the British Supreme Court is a brilliant legal mind, committed to impartiality, who apparently couldn't or didn't correctly read a ruling. Now, maybe these rulings are very complex. I would have assumed if you got an undergraduate degree in law, you could read a ruling. So what is taking brilliant legal minds? I don't want to say they became legally illiterate, God forbid. I don't want to be cruel or harsh.
I think I actually used that term in a committee meeting on this very issue.
It's possible I got that from you. It's possible that's why it circulates in my brain, legally illiterate. I just remember, yeah, that very likely came from you. I don't remember where everything in my head came from. But how does that happen? Is it that they're so inherently deeply anti-Israel? Is it they exist in this thought climate where it's hostilities assumed? Like, what's going on? Because it's very frightening.
You're absolutely right. It's an excellent question. I'm not sure I have all of the answers for this, because I think you probably a psychology degree is probably required to explain the nuances of it. But certainly when this first letter came out, as you've described, a letter to the Prime Minister advocating an arms embargo on Israel because it had been found either plausibly guilty of genocide or that the court found that there was a plausible risk of genocide. That letter was actually headed up by, as you correctly described, two former members of the Supreme Court. The former president of the Supreme Court, Baroness Brenda Hale, and former Supreme Court Judge Lord Jonathan Sumption. And when I saw this letter, I think they had something like 600 signatories when they sent it. I read it in disbelief. There was already very quickly, after the first provisional measures order was given, a massive misreporting about what this provisional measures order from January 2024 said. And it is extraordinary to me that it was so difficult to comprehend because it was there in black and white. I don't possess any particular, divisional powers here. I simply read what was said in the order, and immediately I was watching legal commentators supposedly interpreting this as though the court had found Israel plausibly guilty of genocide. I challenged that in every media interview I did, but my jaw fell even further to the floor when I saw what this letter was claiming, which was just bonkers. So the first thing I did is tell my colleagues at UKLFI, we have to write a response. And frankly, it wasn't clear if we would be able to muster, 600 signatories. And I said, it doesn't matter. The quality of the letter will speak for itself. The fact that we are accurate about this will speak for itself. And it was a collective effort to make sure that it had group sign off. And as you say, we ended up getting, I think, something like 1,400, maybe more signatures. So far more than the original letter. But then, of course, there came this riposte, which doubled down exactly on the original misinformation. And I must say, it wasn't just the total misinterpretation and perhaps misleading presentation of the provisional measures order. There were other aspects of in relation to the casualty figures, in relation to levels of aid getting in this letter that were also entirely false, and our response addressed all of that. What was interesting to me, though, is that even after our response had received such support from the legal community, the original letter was being reported consistently in the press with no mention of the letter of response. And I thought that was exceptionally telling as to what it is that the BBC and the like were wishing to report on this subject. This culminated, at least for me, in an invitation to a parliamentary committee where I gave evidence alongside Jonathan Sumption on various topics, but specifically on this point, on the meaning of this Provisional Measures Order. And I set out in clear terms what we had said in the letter and what it stated clearly in terms in the order itself. And Lord Sumption called my position in the committee barely arguable. Now, it was something like less than 36 hours later that the interview you described dawned on you, the former president of the ICJ who wrote this order, who had by this point retired, gave what I can only call an unprecedented interview, because judges don't normally speak in such terms about rulings they had given and orders that had been issued. But she came out on BBC, on Hard Talk, and vindicated every single word I had said. And the extraordinary thing is that many of these people are still making representations. I saw this, in fact, recently in some proceedings, making representations that suggest that the ICJ found Israel plausibly guilty of genocide, even when the woman who wrote the order has come out to explain that this was, of course, not the case. Although, as I say, that would have been clear to anyone who actually read the text. Now I come to this question that you've understandably posed as to why. How is it that these gifted lawyers, well respected, I mean, Lord Sumption was dubbed Britain's biggest brain, for goodness sake. It's hard to find a lawyer and then judge with more of a deeply seated reputation as being an exceptional professional. How is it that people of that caliber can get this so badly wrong? And it seems also be totally unwilling to admit their error. Now, I've watched a number of Lord Sumption's interviews when he's been speaking, I don't know, to Sky News and the BBC. And it struck me that he has consistently said that he bases his opinion and supposedly his legal assessment on what he sees on television. That is the base.
Oh, wow.
So there is a vicious cycle here. These very distressing images that we are continually seeing broadcast on our television screens, some of them accurate, but presented without context, and some of them, frankly, entirely fabricated. We have seen this phenomenon of Pallywood. We have seen the staging of scenes of desperation and starvation, and also, unfortunately, with fake blood and rubble presentation of supposedly dead bodies that are in fact not dead. We've seen all of this. And to the extent that it is featured in these media broadcasts, that is what supposedly these lawyers, judges, including Britain's biggest brain, are basing then a supposed legal assessment on what is happening. And that, I have to say, is coupled with what appears to me to be a lack of awareness or lack of familiarity with how the relevant parts of international law work. So I don't know how many, if any, of the lawyers that signed that original letter have any experience in international law. It doesn't appear to me that those that I had seen, at least the prominent signatories, had. And it's pretty critical that in the law of armed conflict, all of the tests are intention-based, not effects-based. And so all of the allegations that you are hearing so readily peddled by many of these respected individuals are simply baseless. They're not capable of reaching these conclusions, of coming to this particular analysis, because they lack the information as to the intention behind each and every one of the military actions that they are seeking to opine on. Now, this is pretty critical because there are countries that Israel has shared some of that information with, and this will often be sensitive military intelligence that goes into the planning of a strike, the analysis of it, the proportionality assessment, the selection of targets, all of that. Some of that information has indeed been shared over the course of this war, we know with the British government, with the US government, and over the course of this period, they had been consistently saying, both those governments, that they did not have concerns with respect to Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law on proportionality and targeting. So the only entities that have actually any basis to make this assessment have made it in Israel's favor, and absolutely everyone else, especially those being interviewed on international media, who purport to have come to some kind of conclusion on this topic and who accuse Israel of being disproportionate in its conduct in the Gaza Strip, simply don't have a leg to stand on, because they don't have access to the very information that under very basic international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, would be required to be able to start to make that assessment. And that then speaks volumes as to, I think, the veracity with which these, supposed lawyers or judges or other commentators are approaching this subject. It cannot be taken seriously, and it is deeply unfortunate that, especially in the media, they are consistently being presented as authorities on the subject.
Wow. So this has actually only reinforced the fear, the worry kind of angle that I was coming from, and I'm sure many of our viewers are. And I'll tell you what my next train of thought goes to as I'm listening to you say all this. If that's true of the great minds in the legal world in Britain, because you were saying earlier there are people deliberately spreading these falsehoods, but what we're seeing here is these are not people deliberately spreading the falsehoods. Maybe there's some people behind the campaigns that are. But these are actually extremely good legal minds who are being swept along by the demonization campaign to reach absurd positions, to suddenly, because maybe they're so emotional, so biased through, I guess, what a normal human being who doesn't know much about it, just watching the media, would come to think, that they, like all human beings, are clouded by their prior perception, their emotions, and then it distorts their ability to read a simple legal text. But now let's think about these international bodies themselves, the ICC, the ICJ. How are they going to rule? I was thinking about this myself. I looked a bit into how the ICJ is appointed. The judges are pretty much all appointed by the United Nations General Assembly and a majority at the Security Council. And you ask yourself, what are these bodies all about? Like, what goes on in these bodies? And every single year, without fail, it doesn't matter what is going on in the world, whether Israel's at war or not, whether there's 30 wars going on in the world or 50, which is the typical range, whether there's famines in the world with tens of millions of people suffering, consistently, every single year, the United Nations General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, 2/3 of all their resolutions will be about condemning Israel. 1/3 about all the actual genocides, wars, famines, tens of millions of people suffering, slavery. 1/3, 2/3 condemnation of Israel. So obviously there's a very high priority for many nations to focus the UN on it. Presumably they've picked judges to fulfill that mission. And even if they didn't, even if they were neutral judges, they could be swept along by these media demonization campaigns. Does Israel have any hope in these forums?
So a couple of things I'd like to pick up. Just firstly on the individuals being swept along in this misinformation. I think that's extremely easy to understand when you see some of the propaganda images that are being deployed here, and in particular these fake images of starving children. I use that term because each and every one of them has been debunked on the basis that these are very ill children for various illnesses or birth defects or really serious underlying health conditions that have essentially been, abused for these propaganda purposes by being photographed. No one looking at these photographs seems to have actually looked at the other individuals in the frame. On a number of occasions, I've seen this child's mother either holding it or sat next to it. On occasion with a double chin. I've never seen such a well-fed mother who would eat before her starving child. But of course, that hasn't really been remarked upon in the context of many of these images that have run on the front pages of respected newspapers, because you see an image like that, which is distressing. Any normal individual feels it keenly, and logic, reason, analysis, all of that goes out of the window. It's a guttural response. And I think this has been at the core of the attitude that we have seen, because the only alternative explanation is that essentially they've all taken leave of their senses. So that's critical on a personal level. So far as the judges are concerned, you're absolutely right that this is not a court, the International Court of Justice, by the standards that you or I would be familiar with in the UK or the US or even in Israel. These are judges that have been essentially appointed for political reasons by the countries that they represent. Yes, they are approved by the UN mechanisms, but they are each a representative that is selected by the country that sends them. And it's unfathomable, that Russia would send, say, a judge to the ICJ that could potentially rule against Russian interests. These are judges sent to this institution, this international court, in order to serve a purpose and protect the interests of the country that has nominated them. And it's not just, of course, the Russian Federation. The US's judge that has been appointed, that is now currently serving on the International Court of Justice, Sarah Cleveland, was a professor at Columbia Law School while I was there as a fellow in the National Security Program. I would say her anti-Israel stance was plain to see, but in fact, so was her anti-US stance in the lectures that she gave and in the sort of, she would say, criticism that she leveled against the United States for its conduct internationally. So the fact of the matter is that the academy as a whole, following this, anti-colonialism bent, anti-Western bent, has produced professionals of a particular caliber in the West that are to a startling degree anti-Western. That is often then reflected in some of these appointments. Sarah Cleveland is a case in point. And of course, the crossover, in particular in the academy and the international legal world, is unparalleled. You have a lot of back and forth between academics and judges and other professionals, practitioners within the international legal system. Another very good example of how absurd some of these supposed judges are is the former president of the International Court of Justice, who sat through many of the hearings with respect to cases that have been brought against Israel, both the ICJ case that South Africa has brought, but also a number of advisory opinions, which is another mechanism available at the International Court of Justice, which is also being abused in order to target Israel. This is Judge Salam, who in his former position as Lebanon's ambassador to the United Nations, so before he took up his role as an ICJ judge, his track record of calling Israel a terror state, of accusing it of war crimes, would have in any normal court have required him to recuse himself from sitting in judgment on those same issues that he had previously professed such strong opinions on, but of course not at the ICJ. And it's perhaps worthy of note that he took leave of his position as the president of the International Court of Justice in order to become Prime Minister of Lebanon, which is where he is currently serving, as I understand it, involved in the negotiations now with Israeli counterparts. So that is perhaps a flavour of some of the issues with respect to the judges at these so-called courts. But there is another very problematic aspect here, which is something to do with the way that the broader international system works, this ecosystem of hatred against Israel that spawns the sorts of resolutions that you have referenced. And it's inextricably linked with the way that these courts are now approaching these very same issues. There is, if you will, a cycle, a cyclical process of disinformation laundering. And it starts with certain NGOs, some of them formerly quite well respected, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch in particular, who've put out reports claiming that Israel is guilty of genocide. I use this example and we can sort of track it through. Now, I was asked to come and debate Amnesty International in Copenhagen and in Oslo about their report accusing Israel of genocide. And one of the first things I'd mentioned in the context of these two debates was the methodology section of this report, which made it perfectly plain that Amnesty International did not have people on the ground in Gaza. Instead, they said they relied upon local government authorities. So they take information from Hamas, they stick it into a document headed up with their logo, they send it out into the ether. That gets in turn picked up by individuals like Francesca Albanese, by the UN Commission of Inquiry at the Human Rights Council. It forms part of the resolutions that you're referencing at the Human Rights Council. Things like that get picked up by the UN General Assembly also. And then that may also in turn get cycled up to the ICC and the ICJ that routinely quote UN reports as part of their proceedings. At that point, Amnesty International will step back and point and say, see, the ICJ says so, and that cycle of disinformation is complete. But that's where this false information comes from. That is the process of, cleansing it or making it irrefutable. And the follow-on prospect of that is that these false documents will then later on be deployed as supposed evidence in domestic courts around the world, where increasingly individual Israelis are finding themselves under attack. There is no evidence that can be put, real evidence that can be put to substantiate and justify many of these bogus claims that are being brought against them. But once you have these manufactured documents of false evidence, but that have either the UN or the ICJ stamp of approval on them, that whole process becomes a very, very different one. And I think that is absolutely where this whole lawfare process, the abuse of these legal processes, legal institutions to advance a political cause, that is where this process of lawfare, I believe, is ultimately leading us. And unfortunately, it will be coming to a court near you.
Right. And this frightening scenario which you're painting, I'm smiling, but perhaps I shouldn't be. But I'm smiling because on the one hand, it's so hopeless. On the other, it's so comical. But perhaps more than anything else, it's so familiar. And when I say that, if you look at the history of Jew demonization throughout every era, it's been at its most potent when it weaponizes a legal system or anything else that represents the high ethical standards that people look up to for a kind of objective judgment of what's going on. And I'm talking whether it was the Talmud on trial in early medieval times, found guilty, so the entire basis of Jewish religion is guilty, is intrinsically evil, leading to expulsions of Jewish communities and massacres, whether it was blood libels that so often were sent to courts, and sometimes even when it was so obvious that even the court itself had to rule that the accusation was false, it still stuck. But there were times when the courts at the time found guilt, and then later on people reviewing it were like, this was clearly a kangaroo court. But at the time it convinced people, whether it's obviously very famously the Dreyfus affair, I assume famous to all our viewers, but Alfred Dreyfus, who was a senior in the French military, was accused of treason, found at the time guilty, and then not long afterwards it was clear that it was a sham and it was fake. Whether it was Nazi courts in Nazi Germany that had so much respect to the population, legal institutions finding Jews and Jewish institutions guilty of all sorts of ludicrous things. And on the one hand, always 30 years later or 100 years later, the world looks back with shame at how could the courts do that? This was clearly part of a society-wide buying into this mind virus of Jew demonization, Jew derangement. And it's clear that's what's happening today. So on the one hand, we know that in 50 years, 100 years, even much less, 30, 20 years, people are going to look back. And this is going to be, people like, the accusers like to pretend it's the most filmed, whatever crime they want to throw to it. But what it really is the most recorded blood libel in history. Because we will actually have grandchildren are going to look at their grandparents' social media accounts and go, you bought into this stuff? People are going to ask the children of those judges what was going on. But so often in history, that backlash comes after horrific actions already been taken against Jewish people, after Jewish people have been massacred in the streets or expelled from a country or boycotted or whatever. Now, please God, we're not going to have any of that. But I guess that's what this leads me to is, so what can we do? You mentioned right at the beginning that you're proud of the successes of the work you've got. At the same time, we're looking at this seemingly unstoppable force that truth is going to be irrelevant in this process. I mean, maybe a miracle will happen and the ICJ will actually say the earth is round rather than the equivalent of the earth is flat. I always tell people there's two groups on trial here. Israel's on trial in the short term. The ICJ and UN is on trial, as history shows, in the long term. Is there something that can be done? I don't know, could Israel appoint a series of serious international scholars who review all of this as part of their reviews into September 11th, produce an internationally credible report into the weaponization of lawfare and other things? Like, what can be done? Can Israel realistically defend itself in those courts? Can it produce some meta system of credibility that actually does demonstrate to the world a counter narrative? What are your thoughts? I'm sure you've got lots.
Trying to find some broader, all-encompassing solution strikes me, a little bit like those people that argue that there's some sort of fix-all solution that will bring us peace in the Middle East. And I fundamentally believe that when you're dealing with problems of this scale and nature, it is the incremental work that is critical. Now, by the same token, occasionally it's been suggested to me that I am seeking to hold back the ocean with a broom, and I can, why it is that particular analogy might have been selected. But if we've got a whole army of brooms being deployed in this particular respect, then that starts to have a little bit more of an effect. The reason I'm so encouraged by the successes that we have had over the last decade and a half is because they serve as a proof of concept that these efforts can, in fact, wield results and can help individuals on a case-by-case basis. And fundamentally, there has to be a response to the falsehoods that we are hearing so widely propagated. And part of the difficulty is that general levels of literacy on international law in particular are not especially high. And so even people who consider themselves to be pro-Israel, understand the situation relatively well, and know ultimately that Israel is on the side of right here, often find it very difficult to push back against this misinformation because they don't feel that they have the ammunition to do so. So, the next time someone says to you, Rabbi, Israel's breaking international law, I might encourage you to ask them which law. Invariably, I think you will find that they're not going to be able to tell you because the accusation is untrue. And in so many of these respects, even if they start quoting aspects of international law to you, there are full responses to each of them. Many of them are, in fact, articulated on the UKLFI Charitable Trust website, where we've put out a number of these briefings. But I think that is the key. If you're asking me what the solution here is, it's education. And it is education specifically on international law and how it is being weaponized and abused, and how that misinformation is misinforming and, as I said earlier, pulling the wool over so many people's eyes. One of the best ways, I think, in which we are going to equip ourselves to combat this phenomenon is by understanding it. And I still hearken back to the late, great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks's analysis of anti-Semitism as a mutating virus, because it tells us exactly what it is that we are dealing with. Lord Sacks had explained that whereas anti-Semitism may have begun as a hatred of the Jews as a religion, may have then mutated to hate them as a race, where eugenics was used to justify that hatred, that the hatred of the Jews today manifests itself against their state. And so the hatred against the state of Israel, or this phenomenon of anti-Zionism, as it is sometimes called, that manifests itself in international law. And that's why these modern blood libels that target the Jewish state, as opposed to the Jewish religion or the Jewish race specifically, that's why international law is the key mechanism, the key delivery mechanism, if you will, for these modern blood libels and this sort of disinformation. Once we've understood that, and I think understood the importance of fighting back on the abuse of international law and international legal terminology, I think that's an enormous step forward to holding back this ocean with many, many brooms or anything else that we can fashion that might be more effective. But it ultimately comes down to education, and educating not just those, that will be watching this podcast, say perhaps within the community, also educating those outside of those who feel favor towards Israel, and educating them especially that what starts with the Jews does not end with the Jews. And the weaponization of international law that we have seen with respect to Israel is going to continue. It doesn't just undermine the international legal order itself, it also provides a mechanism to attack Western civilization more broadly. And we've seen recent resignations or applications for early release from members of the SAS, Special Forces in the United Kingdom. This was big news in the last few days. That has been said to be as a direct result of the fear that these individuals have that they will be targeted by lawfare initiatives. So what began as initiatives against Israeli soldiers now seems to be moving very quickly to initiatives against British soldiers. There are many in the US that are concerned about the same with respect to the International Criminal Court completely outstepping its jurisdiction with respect to the arrest warrants issued against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. There's no surety that the court won't go after Americans next, even though America, like Israel, is not a member of the court. So we're seeing this broadening of these lawfare initiatives. And I think one of the key aspects of education that we need to commit ourselves to is making people across the West, across the civilized world, understand that those that are wielding this weapon of lawfare are coming for their way of life, and that this is not just Israel's problem. And I hope that by that, we will be effective and we will see, what you describe in however many years or however many generations, people turning around and thinking, how could there have been such a collective loss of reason and judgment? And how could so many well-meaning individuals have been so entirely swept up in this deeply, deeply anti-Semitic campaign?
Wow. I guess there's a few different follow-ups I would have on this. One would be to ask you, but I'm conscious of the time. One would be to ask, well, okay, that's nice in theory. How does that work in practice? Because I'm sure you've been at it for a very long time, and the power of the tidal wave seems to be getting stronger, not weaker, but maybe we're not familiar with the tremendous successes you've had, and that would be useful to hear. But I think also from a viewer perspective, like, what is it that we can do to maintain hope and positivity? And what is it that people can do to help on the educational side of this that you're talking about?
So there's the sort of the good news and the bad news. I don't think that we've even seen the start of these lawfare initiatives. I fundamentally believe that this is not just, the eighth front of this war, but will perhaps be the most important front going forward, noting Israel's remarkable successes on the battlefield, but how very much the Israeli Defense Forces have been hamstrung by the false narratives deploying or falsely deploying weaponizing international law, that is inextricably linked to Israel's ability to defend itself with respect to, arms embargoes and restrictions the former US administration had placed, and some of the rhetoric that we even have coming out of this US administration, and certainly everything we have seen from the current government in the United Kingdom. So that really does need to be taken seriously. And as I say, I think this is just, getting into gear. This is the warm-up period, and it desperately requires us to take it seriously. The flip side of that is that, I fundamentally believe that the truth will out, and that ultimately when these issues are subject to proper analysis, when the facts are properly assessed, the truth does become blatantly obvious. And it just requires, I think, a more concerted initiative to call out the misinformation and to hold those that are spreading it to account. And numbers is key to that. So when people are watching this and thinking, oh my goodness, what can I do? I fundamentally believe there is a responsibility on all of us that care about these issues. And, I approach this as a lawyer, as a barrister, with commitment to the rule of law, and to the proper application of the law. So I appreciate that, my focus here is perhaps somewhat sharper than those, outside of that particular bucket. But for those that care, there is always more that can be done to arm yourselves with the facts, with the proper analysis of international law, and to deploy that if it's at work, in conversations by the water cooler, if it's at the dinner parties that some in the community may still be invited to, if it is with respect to what is being taught at your children's school or at university, or in writing to the editors of newspapers or members of parliament, or making complaints with respect to content that you see on the BBC. All of this does make a significant difference. And the critical, counterfactual is, what happens if nobody does anything? And we have evidence of that. I remember 20 years ago hearing Alan Dershowitz talking about the term occupation. He said when it first started to be used here, we all knew that it was wrong, but we didn't bother pushing back because we all knew. And then he said it became so entrenched and so widely used that it became impossible to challenge it. This was 20 years ago. He said it's become so commonplace that now it's too late. It's too late to push back on that. Now, I don't accept it's ever too late to push back on something that is untrue. But if we allow these other modern blood libels to follow that trajectory of the false use of occupation, then of course the exact same thing will happen. And so at least providing that opposition, holding those that spread these falsehoods accountable, and educating as much as possible, and filling that vacuum that seems to exist now whenever international law is being discussed, specifically with respect to Israel, that only these false allegations seem to gain traction and there is very, very little said in response. Filling that vacuum is, a win in and of itself, making sure that there is opposition to what is being spread. And then, the prospect of actually winning those arguments, pushing back on that, then becomes a very much more realistic one. But the start of this is filling that gap and making sure that those that are impressionable on this subject, those that are keen to learn, are provided with the reality, the facts, and the real law on this, and not just the disinformation which is running riot.
One question I have that's slightly different to all of this. You quoted Rabbi Sachs before, and I remember, I think he said it a few times, but anti-Semitism is difficult to pin down exactly what it is, but there's no question whether from a religious or secular perspective, it's probably entered the psyche of mankind because of the position Jews occupy in the religious texts of Christianity and Islam as very central people. And it explains why, unlike other hatreds, anti-Semitism always comes with an accusation of extreme claims about immorality of the Jewish people. It's not just we hate them because they look different. It's they've got to be doing something sick or immoral. To the point where either they'll take something Jews are doing that's accepted by anybody else, but it becomes this crazy crime. So like when Jews were moneylenders, you can imagine people not liking moneylenders knocking on the door for interest. But when they're replaced by Italian banking families, there is no prejudice against Italians. So suddenly it's just an understandable part of society. Or when Jews are poor, it's like the greatest crime against the world, the leeches who suck society. And when Jews are not poor, poverty is understood with sympathy. And suddenly when Jews are successful, it's like, oh my goodness, they're taking over the world. So perhaps the deepest wound anybody could throw against a people who have stood at the core of our being, from our text through our history, for justice, is to accuse us of being unjust. Who've stood for life is to accuse us of being killers. Who've been the victims of genocides and built institutions to fight them is to throw those very accusations back against us. And I wonder about the flip side of that. First, I wonder if you agree with that, but more importantly, the flip side of it, which is whether you're impacted by this. Obviously, we're impacted personally by we're under attack, we've got to defend ourselves. But more broadly, the commitment to truth and justice, if you feel that stems from obviously human value, but from your own Jewish upbringing and identity as well.
It must do. I try to think about why I was, drawn to the law. And a great deal of that is a real love of debate and argument, which of course, the Jewish tradition is perhaps second to none in. And that comes with it, it brings with it, I think, a real commitment to the truth. I mean, why is it that we argue and debate topics sometimes to ridiculous degrees? It's to get to the correct answer most of the time, and when there isn't one, to get to the best possible explanation and analysis. And it's that prospect of constantly testing yourself and holding yourself, I think, to a higher standard, ultimately emerges from that too. So one of the things that gives me most pride and optimism for the future is seeing how Israel, the state, and its national institutions, most especially the army here, have held themselves to a standard that is unprecedented. Certainly, so far as the conduct of the IDF is concerned, unprecedented in the history of warfare. The standards that the IDF holds itself to, I think, are also a reflection of the moral code, the purity of arms that that every soldier has, relayed to them in their first week of basic training. And at the core of that is also a fundamental aspect of Jewish tradition, which is the preservation of life. Protecting life at nearly any cost. And that is something that's pervasive through, the way that the IDF has applied international law, and in so many respects going far above the requirements of the laws of armed conflict, according to these new standards that are set. I was in Gaza in 2024 with military experts from 6 NATO countries and very senior officers amongst them. They were absolutely gobsmacked at the measures that Israel was putting in place and the standards that it was setting. And I could tell also not a little concerned about what that would mean for their own practices. As former commanders in moral armies, many of them, that knew the operational difficulties, if not impossibilities, of seeking to emulate similar standards in their own operations. So Israel is unique in so many respects. I think a great deal of it, its uniqueness, is as a result, a sort of oozing out of the religious, the cultural, the traditional groundings of the state and of the Jewish people, and that desire to be a light unto the nations. Whether that manifests itself in upholding the rule of law, whether it manifests itself in being the first on the scene in disaster areas to provide assistance to the rest of humanity. That is something that I think is pervasive. But I think you are fundamentally right that a commitment to law, which is also hugely significant in the Jewish tradition and the Talmudic tradition, and Jewish law having such a central focus in religious teaching and in all of that discussion and debate that I mentioned, necessarily, I think, influences 2 aspects of this. Firstly, the way that Israel conducts itself, but also the internal criticisms that Israel and Israelis engage in. And often those internal criticisms, which may be legitimate and may all be geared towards striving for an even better scenario, are then hijacked externally and presented as, quote unquote, legitimate criticisms. To a certain extent, perhaps because, Israel and Israelis hold themselves to such a high standard, they make it a lot easier to be subject to these attacks from external sources. But all of this inevitably, I think, plays a very strong role in what we have seen and what we are witnessing. And of course, the one perhaps facet of Lord Sachs's explanation, Rabbi Sachs's explanation that I didn't quite touch upon, was that in every era, anti-Semitism has manifested itself in accordance with whatever the order of the day was. So in the Middle Ages, it was religion. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it was science. But today, the order of the day, according to Rabbi Sachs, was then, when he was alive, and continues to be, international law and human rights. And so that's an additional reason why we see so much of this criticism being advanced within that formula, within that framework. And ultimately, if you are seeking to accuse, the Jewish people of the crime of crimes, then that's going to be genocide. And the fact that you are inverting this allegation and you are accusing the victims of genocide of committing the very crime that was committed against them, that is plainly an additional very concerning facet of this. But it also in that sense makes sense, where projection is central to so many of these false allegations that are being made against Israel. On every one of these blood libels, it is in fact the Jews that have been the victim of these allegations that are being levied as opposed to the perpetrators. And genocide is a case in point. I don't just mean the victims of genocide and the Holocaust that gave rise to the very inception of the term. This term was coined by Raphael Lemkin to provide legal terminology to the Jewish experience of being targeted for extermination because they were Jews. But I also mean those victims of acts of genocide on the 7th of October by Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, members of Fatah and other Palestinian terrorist organizations, and indeed, as we're told, civilians that crossed the border in order to engage in this brutality and this slaughter and torture of human beings. So all of that doesn't provide a singular answer in response to your question, I appreciate, but I think there are many layers that have influenced the phenomenon that we're seeking to both break down, grapple with, and of course, in due course, provide a robust response and answer to.
Right. Wow. Natasha, thank you so much. Although there's been a lot of this that's difficult to hear, and I think that's just being realistic with where we're at, we also get inspired. I think it was last year where you were invited to the torch of Yom Ha'atzmaut here, weren't you? Is that my mistake? No, I got that one right. Okay. Yeah. And I remember at the time, it was actually much more difficult than now. There was still lots of hostages in Gaza. There was still a lot of national turmoil about is the priority defeating Hamas? Is it getting the hostages back? And yeah, we're certainly not out of the firepower that's being arrayed against us militarily, and certainly not at the legal level. But Jewish survival and that metaphor of carrying that torch and lighting it is something very powerful. And obviously something you do in everything you do. And it's something Jewish history, I think, teaches us, that in the short term, evil can do horrific things. Demonization can do terrible things. But in the long term, the light of truth and justice, and whether as me as a religious Jew, I would certainly say that the hand of God driving this all, but however somebody interprets it, is that in the long run, the light wins. And it's always been a privilege to be a part of the Jewish people, and a part of, yes, being deeply self-critical, trying to work out how we can shine a light irrelevant to the darkness around us. But the good work that you do and so many others do will no doubt be a part of the light that will continue through history and be looked at with pride by future generations. So really, thank you so much for giving us the time, and you should have a lot of success, a lot of atzlacha in everything that you do.
That was beautifully put, and I'm very grateful indeed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If this is content that you like, please do remember to like, to subscribe, and to click the notification button, and to leave any comments below, anything you like, didn't like, want to argue with, want to see more of. Until next time, may God bless you all.